359 BC. The kingdom of Macedonia stood on the brink of total collapse. King Perdiccas III lay dead on a blood-soaked battlefield in Illyria, along with 4,000 Macedonian soldiers, the cream of the kingdom's military strength. Illyrian warlords occupied the western territories. Thracian tribes raided from the east. Paeonian raiders struck from the north. Athens, the cultural heart of Greece, manoeuvred to seize Macedonian coastal cities. The treasury was empty, the army was shattered, the nobility questioned whether Macedonia would survive the month. Into this catastrophe stepped a 23-year-old prince who would transform military history forever. Philip II ascended the Macedonian throne not through hereditary right, but through desperate necessity. His nephew, the rightful heir, was an infant. The kingdom needed a warrior king immediately, or it would cease to exist. What happened next would change warfare for 2,000 years. Philip had spent 3 years as a hostage in Thebes from 367 to 360 BC, not imprisoned but living among the military elite of Greece's most powerful city. There he witnessed something extraordinary. The Theban general Epaminondas had revolutionized Greek warfare at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, crushing the previously invincible Spartans through tactical innovation. Philip watched the Theban sacred band train daily, 300 elite hoplites who moved with mechanical precision, their formation shifting with practiced ease. He studied how Theban commanders concentrated overwhelming force at decisive points. He learned that victory came not from individual heroism, but from disciplined collective action. But Philip saw something the Thebans hadn't fully exploited. The traditional Greek hoplite phalanx, while formidable, had fatal limitations. Hoplites fought with a 7-foot spear called the doru and a massive shield, the aspis, that weighed 15 pounds. The formation was 8 men deep, each warrior protecting the man to his left with his shield. This created a wall of bronze and muscle that could steamroll lighter infantry. The problem was reach and flexibility. At 7 feet, the doru gave hoplites minimal range advantage. In a head-on clash between 2 hoplite phalanxes, the outcome depended on pushing power, endurance, and individual combat skill. Battles became brutal shoving matches where men stabbed over and under shields, trying to find gaps in armour. Philip returned to Macedonia with a radical vision. He would create an entirely new type of infantry that would make traditional hoplites obsolete. The weapon that would make this possible was the Sarissa. Ancient sources differ on its exact length, but modern scholarship places the Sarissa at 16 to 18 feet for Philip's infantry, possibly reaching 21 feet in some variants. This was nearly triple the length of a hoplite spear. The Sarissa wasn't simply a longer spear. It was a specialized weapon that required complete reimagining of infantry combat. Made from cornel wood, known for its toughness and flexibility, the Sarissa weighed 12 to 14 pounds. No warrior could possibly wield it one-handed. This meant abandoning the massive hoplite shield. Instead, Philip's infantry carried a small round shield called a pelta, about 2 feet in diameter, suspended from the neck by a leather strap. This left both hands free to wield the enormous pike. The tactical implications were staggering. When a Macedonian phalanx advanced in formation 16 men deep, the first 5 rows could lower their sarissas horizontally. This created a hedge of iron spear points projecting 15 feet beyond the front rank. An enemy formation armed with 7-foot spears couldn't get close enough to strike. They faced 5 layers of pike points, all beyond their reach. Even if an attacker somehow got past the first row of sarissas, 4 more rows waited to impale him. The rear 11 ranks angled their pikes upward at 45 degrees, creating a second defensive layer that deflected incoming arrows and javelins. This turned the phalanx into a moving fortress, nearly impervious to missile fire from above. But creating this weapon system required solving enormous technical and training challenges. The sarissa's length made it unwieldy. Carrying an 18-foot pike through mountainous Macedonian terrain was exhausting. Philip's solution was ingenious. The sarissa was manufactured in 2 sections that joined via a bronze coupling sleeve before battle. This made transport manageable and allowed replacement of broken sections. Each sarissa had an iron spearhead shaped like a leaf blade, designed to penetrate armour and flesh. Modern scholars debate whether these heads were large and heavy or small and armour-piercing. Evidence suggests Philip used relatively small diamond-shaped points that concentrated force at a single point, capable of punching through bronze armour and the shields of opposing infantry. At the butt end, each sarissa had a bronze spike called a sorita. This served multiple purposes. It balanced the weapon, making it easier to control. It could be driven into the ground to brace against cavalry charges. And if the spearhead broke, a phalangite could reverse his sarissa and fight with the butt spike. The real revolution wasn't the weapon itself, but how Philip trained his men to use it. Traditional Greek armies were militia forces. Farmers and craftsmen would answer the call to arms, fight for a season, then return home. They trained occasionally, fought in familiar formations, and relied on individual courage. Philip created something unprecedented in the Greek world, a professional standing army. He instituted mandatory military service, requiring 1 in 10 able-bodied Macedonian men to serve. But unlike traditional levies, these soldiers were paid regular wages. They trained year-round. They drilled, constantly in complex maneuvers that would have been impossible for part-time militia. The physical demands were brutal. Philip ordered forced marches where infantry carried not just their weapons and armour, but also personal supplies weighing 30 to 40 pounds. They marched up to 20 miles per day through Macedonia's mountainous terrain, building endurance that would prove critical in later campaigns. The tactical training was even more demanding. The phalanx had to function as a single organism. If the formation broke, if gaps appeared between files, the entire unit became vulnerable. Individual phalangites couldn't defend themselves effectively with their cumbersome pikes. Their survival depended on maintaining tight formation. Philip drilled his infantry relentlessly in a series of maneuvers. They practiced moving from column into line. They learned to wheel left and right while maintaining alignment. They practiced the synaspismos, a compressed formation where the intervals between soldiers shrank to 1.5 feet, creating an almost impenetrable mass. Most importantly, they learned to respond to trumpet signals instantly, changing formation in the chaos of battle. The organizational structure reinforced this cohesion. Philip organized his phalanx into units called taxis, battalions of 1,500 men each. Each taxis was recruited from a specific region of Macedonia, with officers drawn from the local nobility. This created regional pride and fierce loyalty. Within each taxis, the basic unit was the syntagma, a block of 256 men, arranged in 16 files, each 16 men deep. Each file had a leader at front called a decadarch, and another experienced soldier at the rear. These veterans received double pay and were responsible for maintaining formation integrity, preventing the rear ranks from breaking and running. The social psychology was crucial. Philip called his infantry pegetiroi, foot companions. This elevated peasant soldiers to the same status as the aristocratic cavalry, the hetasaroi or companions. For the first time, Macedonian commoners had a stake in the kingdom's success beyond mere survival. They were companions of the king, partners in conquest. But weapons and training meant nothing without tactical doctrine. Philip didn't simply copy the Theban system, he synthesized it with his own innovations to create combined arms warfare. The genius was in how he used the phalanx and cavalry together. The phalanx was the anvil. Its job was to fix the enemy in place, to create an immovable obstacle that held the opposing centre. The pikes made frontal assault suicidal. Enemy formations had to engage the phalanx or risk being outflanked. While the phalanx held the enemy's attention, Philip used his cavalry as the hammer. The elite companion cavalry, drawn from Macedonian nobility, were heavy shock cavalry, armed with 9-foot lances called zistons. Philip trained them to charge in wedge formation, a tactic learned from the Scythians and Thracians. The wedge concentrated force at a single point, smashing through enemy formations. The tactical sequence became Philip's signature move. The phalanx would engage the enemy centre, fixing them in place with its impenetrable pike hedge. Meanwhile, Philip would lead the companion cavalry against a weak point in the enemy line, usually a flank. The cavalry would shatter that section, then wheel around behind the enemy while they were still engaged with the phalanx. Caught between the advancing phalanx and cavalry attacking from behind, enemy formations disintegrated. This required precise timing and iron discipline. The phalanx had to hold while outnumbered, sometimes absorbing heavy casualties, trusting that the cavalry breakthrough would come. The cavalry had to strike at exactly the right moment, neither too early when the enemy could respond, nor too late when the phalanx might break. Philip tested this system in a series of battles that transformed Macedonia from a failing backwater into the dominant power in Greece. In 358 BC, he defeated the Illyrians who had killed his brother, using the new phalanx to create a killing zone that slaughtered thousands. The surviving Illyrian warlords sued for peace. In 357 BC, he captured Amphipolis, a strategically vital city Athens had claimed for decades. The siege showcased another Philip innovation. He had developed a sophisticated siege train including rams, towers, and catapults. Combined with his disciplined infantry, this made Macedonian forces capable of reducing fortifications that would have stopped earlier Greek armies. By 356 BC, Philip controlled the crucial gold and silver mines of Mount Pangaion. This wealth funded his military expansion. He could now afford to maintain a standing army year-round, pay for the best equipment, and hire Greek mercenaries to supplement his Macedonian corps. The defining test came at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC. Philip faced a coalition of Greek city-states led by Athens and Thebes, the two most powerful military forces in Greece. The Greek army included the legendary Theban Sacred Band, 300 elite hoplites who had never been defeated. Ancient sources give wildly varying numbers, but modern scholars estimate Philip commanded about 30,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, while the Greeks fielded roughly the same numbers. The Greeks held strong defensive ground with their flanks protected by the Cephissus River and rough terrain. Philip deployed his phalanx in the centre, with his 18-year-old son Alexander commanding the companion cavalry on the left wing. Philip himself commanded the right wing, positioned opposite the Athenian hoplites. The battle opened with Philip executing a feigned retreat on the right, drawing the Athenians forward. This was an extraordinarily difficult manoeuvre, requiring the phalanx to retreat backwards, uphill while maintaining formation, all while under pressure from pursuing Athenians. The discipline required was staggering. One break in the line and the Athenians would pour through, rolling up the entire formation. But Philip's years of drilling paid off. The phalanx withdrew in perfect order, luring the Athenians into broken ground. As the Athenian line extended and lost cohesion pursuing Philip, a gap opened in the Greek centre. Alexander saw his moment. Leading the companion cavalry, he charged into that gap, smashing into the flank of the Theban phalanx. The shock of heavy cavalry hitting an infantry formation from the side was devastating. The Thebans tried to turn to face this new threat, but their rigid hoplite formation couldn't pivot quickly. Meanwhile, Philip's phalanx halted its retreat and counter-attacked the exhausted, disorganized Athenians. The Sarissa's reach advantage proved decisive. Athenian hoplites armed with 7-foot spears couldn't get close enough to the Macedonian front ranks to strike. They impaled themselves on the pike hedge, unable to close. The Sacred Band of Thebes, attacked from the side and rear by Alexander's cavalry while engaged with the phalanx from front, fought to the last man. All 300 died where they stood. The Greek coalition lost roughly 1,000 killed. Philip had conquered Greece not through the largest army or the most resources, but through superior organisation, training and tactics. The Sarissa Phalanx had proven itself against the finest infantry in the Greek world. Philip then announced his ultimate ambition. He would invade Persia. 336 BC. An assassin's dagger ended Philip's life at his daughter's wedding. The man who had revolutionized warfare and unified Greece fell to a personal vendetta, the details lost to history. But his military legacy lived on in his son. Alexander III, later called the Great, inherited not just a kingdom but the most sophisticated military machine in the world. 20 years old, educated by Aristotle, tested in battle at Chaeronea, Alexander possessed both intellectual brilliance and physical courage that bordered on recklessness. He also inherited his father's dream, the invasion of Persia. The Achaemenid Persian Empire was the superpower of the ancient world. Founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BC, it stretched from the Mediterranean to India, from Egypt to Central Asia. It commanded resources that dwarfed tiny Macedonia. The Persian army could field hundreds of thousands of soldiers drawn from dozens of subject peoples. Its cavalry was numerous and skilled. Its immortals, the 10,000-strong royal guard, were professional soldiers with a reputation for never breaking. The Persian navy controlled the Mediterranean. Persian gold bought the best Greek mercenary hoplites. On paper, Macedonia had no chance. But Alexander understood what the Persians didn't. His father had created a weapon system that made numerical advantage irrelevant in pitched battle. The Sarissa Phalanx was virtually unbeatable from the front. Persian infantry, armed with shorter spears and lacking the rigid discipline of the phalanx, simply couldn't close with it. Spring 334 BC. Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia with approximately 32,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. At the core were 9,000 Macedonian phalangites, the veterans who had conquered Greece, divided into 6 taxias. Supporting them were 3,000 hypaspists, elite infantry who could fight either as phalangites or as more mobile hoplites, bridging the gap between the phalanx and light troops. The rest were allied Greek hoplites and light infantry. The Persian response was immediate. Satraps, the governors of Asia Minor, gathered their forces at the Granicus River. They commanded approximately 20,000 cavalry and an equal number of infantry, including thousands of Greek mercenary hoplites. The Persians had chosen their ground carefully. The Granicus had steep, muddy banks. Crossing under fire would be nearly suicidal. The Persian cavalry lined the eastern bank, ready to massacre any Macedonians who tried to climb out of the water. Behind them stood the Greek mercenaries, a solid wall of hoplites. Alexander's generals advised waiting for dawn, finding another crossing point, anything but a frontal assault across the river against a prepared enemy. Alexander refused. He understood that allowing the Persians to retreat would turn the entire campaign into an exhausting chase across Asia Minor. He needed a decisive battle now, regardless of the cost. What happened at the Granicus in May 334 BC was Alexander, proving he had learned his father's lessons. He deployed his phalanx in the centre, but this was a feint. The real attack came from his companion cavalry on the right wing, personally led by Alexander. The Macedonians crashed into the river with Alexander at the front, easily identifiable by his polished armour and white-plumed helmet. This wasn't courage, it was calculated leadership. Alexander knew his men would follow him into hell if he led from the front. The river crossing was chaos. Horses struggled through mud and current. Persian cavalry rained down arrows and javelins. Men drowned in their armour. But Alexander's cavalry were trained for shock combat. They didn't stop at the water's edge to regroup. They charged directly up the bank into the Persian cavalry. The fighting was savage and personal. Alexander nearly died multiple times. According to the historian Arrian, Mithridates, King Darius's son-in-law, led a squadron to intercept Alexander. Alexander killed him with a lance through the face. Rusayes, a Persian commander, struck Alexander's helmet with such force that it cracked, nearly splitting his head. Alexander ran him through with his Sarissa. Spithridates raised his sword for a killing blow. Cletus the Black, one of Alexander's bodyguards, severed Spithridates' arm with a single sword stroke, saving Alexander's life. While this desperate cavalry melee raged, the true weapon came into play. The Macedonian phalanx advanced across the river. Once across and reformed on the eastern bank, the Sarissa hedge proved unstoppable. The Persian cavalry, having failed to destroy Alexander's breakthrough, found themselves outflanked. As the phalanx pushed forward, Persian horsemen had to withdraw or be crushed between the phalanx and Alexander's cavalry. The Persian infantry, mostly poorly trained levies, broke almost immediately when the phalanx reached them. Only the Greek mercenaries stood firm, professional hoplites who understood that surrender meant death. Alexander surrounded them and attacked. Even skilled hoplites couldn't prevail against the reach advantage of the Sarissa. Ancient sources report that 2,000 Greek mercenaries died in that final slaughter. Another 2,000 were captured and sent to Macedonia in chains to labour in mines. Alexander's message was clear. Greeks who fought for Persia were traitors. The Battle of the Granicus cost Alexander approximately 115 killed, according to Ptolemy's account, though other sources give higher figures. The Persians lost thousands, including most of their commanders. More importantly, the psychological impact was devastating. Alexander had attacked across a river, uphill, against a prepared enemy, and won. Asia Minor lay open before him. City after city surrendered. Sardis, the wealthy Persian administrative centre, opened its gates without a fight. Ephesus welcomed Alexander as a liberator. Miletus resisted and was stormed. Halicarnassus held out under the brilliant Greek mercenary general Memnon of Rhodes. But Alexander eventually took it through systematic siege warfare. By winter 334 BC, Alexander controlled the entire Anatolian coast. But King Darius III had been gathering his strength. The Persian ruler understood that satraps and mercenaries wouldn't stop the Macedonian invasion. he would have to take the field personally with the full might of the Persian Empire. November 333 BC. The two armies met at Issus, a coastal plain in what is now southern Turkey. Darius had chosen the ground carefully. The battlefield was narrow, squeezed between the Mediterranean Sea and the Amarnus Mountains, only about 2.5 miles wide. This would negate the Persian numerical advantage. They couldn't outflank or surround the smaller Macedonian force. Ancient sources give wildly exaggerated numbers for the Persian army, with some claiming 600,000 men. Modern historians estimate Darius commanded perhaps 100,000 soldiers, including 10,000 immortals, 10,000 Greek mercenary hoplites, and substantial cavalry forces. Alexander's army numbered approximately 40,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. On paper, the Persians had more than a 2-to-1 advantage. Darius positioned himself in the centre with the immortals and Greek mercenaries, the most reliable troops in his army. Heavy Persian cavalry massed on his right wing near the coast. The Persian left, toward the mountains, consisted of lighter cavalry and infantry. The armies were separated by the Pinarus River. Darius had fortified his bank and positioned troops on the foothills to threaten Alexander's right flank. Alexander's deployment was classic combined arms. The phalanx held the centre, 6 taxis of phalangites forming the backbone. On the right, Alexander commanded the companion cavalry and hypaspists. On the left, Parmenion, Alexander's most experienced general, commanded the Thessalian cavalry and allied units. The battle began badly for the Macedonians. As the phalanx advanced across the Pinarus, the river and fortified bank disrupted their tight formation. Gaps opened in the pike hedge. The Greek mercenaries fighting for Persia, professional hoplites who understood how phalanxes fought, exploited these gaps viciously. Ancient sources report that 120 Macedonian officers died in this phase, an indication of how desperate the fighting became. The phalanx was actually pushed back across the river. Meanwhile, on the Macedonian left, Parmenian's cavalry was being pressed hard by superior numbers of Persian horsemen. The weight of Persian cavalry threatened to roll up the entire Macedonian line. This was the crisis point. If Alexander had hesitated, if he had tried to reinforce the struggling centre, or aid Parmenion, the battle might have been lost. Instead, he did what his father had trained him to do. He attacked. Leading the companion cavalry, Alexander charged across the river on the Macedonian right, targeting the junction between the Persian cavalry and infantry. The shock of 2,000 heavy cavalry hitting that seam shattered the Persian left wing. Alexander didn't stop. He wheeled his cavalry toward the centre, directly at Darius. The Persian king stood in his war chariot, surrounded by the immortals, protected by the Greek mercenaries. Alexander carved through them. The fighting around Darius's position was apocalyptic. The immortals were elite infantry, but they faced heavy cavalry led by a king who personally killed enemy commanders. The Greek mercenaries tried to protect Darius, but they were being hammered from behind by Alexander's cavalry, while simultaneously engaged with the phalanx from front. Darius broke. Whether from fear or tactical calculation, the Persian king fled the battlefield. Ancient sources vilify him as a coward, but his logic was sound. If he died, the empire died with him. If he lived, he could raise another army. But the psychological impact of the king fleeing was catastrophic. When Persian soldiers saw Darius's chariot racing away, they realized the battle was lost. The Persian right-wing cavalry, which had been pushing back Parmenion, learned their king had fled, and withdrew to avoid being cut off. The centre collapsed. Thousands of Persian infantry, trapped between the advancing phalanx and Alexander's cavalry, attacking from behind, were slaughtered. The Sarissa proved its worth in that grinding advance. Persian infantry, equipped with 2-metre spears at best, couldn't reach the Macedonian front ranks. They died impaled on pikes they couldn't counter. Casualties at Issus reflected the one-sided nature of the battle. Ancient sources claimed 100,000 Persians died, though modern estimates place the number closer to 20,000. Macedonian losses were perhaps 500 to 1,000 killed. These ratios weren't because Persians were cowards or poor fighters. They died because the Sarissa Phalanx gave Macedonians an insurmountable tactical advantage in close combat. Alexander captured Darius's mother, wife, and children. He also captured the Persian royal treasury at Damascus, giving him the wealth to continue the campaign indefinitely. More importantly, he demonstrated to every city and satrap in the empire that Darius couldn't protect them. Syria surrendered. Phoenicia submitted. Egypt welcomed Alexander as a liberator from Persian rule. For 2 years, Alexander methodically secured his rear, capturing the Mediterranean coast to eliminate the Persian fleet's bases, building a causeway to storm the island city of Tyre when it resisted, besieging Gaza when it defied him. He wasn't just conquering, he was building the logistics network needed for the final campaign into Persia's heartland. Darius spent those 2 years rebuilding his army and refining his tactics. He recognized that fighting the Macedonian phalanx on broken or narrow ground was suicidal. He needed open terrain where he could use his numerical superiority. He chose Gaugamela, a plain near the modern city of Erbil in Iraq. Darius didn't just choose the battlefield, he prepared it. The plain was levelled and smoothed to facilitate his 200 scythed chariots, war machines designed to break phalanx formations. He had the ground cleared of obstacles that might disrupt his cavalry charges. He positioned his army so the Macedonians would have to attack uphill. Ancient sources claim Darius commanded 1 million men at Gaugamela. Modern historians estimate between 100,000 and 250,000, still vastly outnumbering Alexander's 47,000. The Persian army was the most formidable force Darius could assemble. Besides the immortals and Greek mercenaries, he had cavalry from Bactria, Scythia, and Arachosia, some of the finest horsemen in the ancient world. He had war elephants from India. He had troops from every corner of his vast empire. October 1st, 331 BC. Alexander surveyed the Persian host and made a decision that seemed insane. Instead of attacking along the levelled ground Darius had prepared, he began moving obliquely to his right, away from the prepared battlefield onto rougher terrain. Darius had to respond. If Alexander refused battle on the prepared ground, the entire Persian advantage evaporated. Darius began extending his left wing to match Alexander's movement, trying to envelop the Macedonian right. This is what Alexander wanted. As the Persian left extended to prevent being outflanked, gaps began opening in the Persian line. The movements were subtle, but in an army of 100,000 men, even small gaps become significant. Alexander kept moving right, drawing more and more Persian cavalry away from their centre. Finally, Darius committed his scythed chariots, sending them thundering toward the advancing Macedonians. This should have been devastating. 200 chariots with blades on their wheels and poles, pulled by terrified horses, charging into dense infantry formations. But Alexander had prepared for this. As the chariots approached, the Macedonian light infantry, javelineers and archers opened up. They didn't aim for the chariots, they aimed for the horses. Horses are herd animals, they panic easily. Under a hail of missiles, the chariot horses balked, turned, crashed into each other. Drivers were killed. Some chariots reached the phalanx, but Alexander had drilled his men for this moment. The phalanx opened lanes, letting chariots through, then closed behind them. The chariots that penetrated were mobbed and destroyed by the 2nd Infantry line. The chariot attack failed completely. Now Alexander struck. He had seen what he was waiting for. The gap in the Persian left centre had widened as units shifted to contain his rightward movement. With perfect timing, Alexander formed a massive wedge. Companion cavalry at the point, hyperspists and 4 taxeis of the phalanx following, he charged directly at that gap. The wedge smashed into the Persian line like a hammerhead. Macedonian cavalry tore through lighter Persian infantry, who had no chance in close combat against heavy-shot cavalry. Behind the cavalry came the phalanx, the Sarissa hedge driving deep into the Persian formation. Darius, positioned in his centre, suddenly found Macedonian cavalry bearing down on him. The king stood his ground this time. According to legend, Alexander threw a javelin that barely missed Darius, killing his chariot driver instead. The Persian bodyguards and immortals fought desperately to protect their king, but they were fighting Macedonian cavalry from the front, and the phalanx was rolling up behind them. For a second time, Darius fled the battlefield, but this time the situation was more complex. On the Macedonian left, things were going badly. Persian cavalry had broken through and were attacking the Macedonian camp. Part of the Persian cavalry had ridden completely around the Macedonian army and were threatening the rear. The centre phalanx had gaps in it where Indian cavalry had penetrated. Alexander faced a choice: pursue Darius and possibly capture or kill him, ending the war in one stroke but risking his army being surrounded and destroyed, or turn back to save his endangered left wing. He chose his army. Alexander wheeled his cavalry and charged toward Parmenions' position. The Indian and Persian cavalry that had broken through found themselves facing the companion cavalry from one side and the phalanx from another. They were massacred. By the time Alexander reached Parmenion, the Thessalian cavalry had already turned the tide, but the Persian right wing was shattered between three forces. The battle became a rout. Tens of thousands of Persians died in the pursuit. Darius fled toward Bactria in the far east of his empire. The Achaemenid Empire was effectively finished. Within weeks, Babylon surrendered. Susa opened its gates. Persepolis, the ceremonial capital, fell. The Persian treasury, containing perhaps 180,000 talents of gold and silver, fell into Macedonian hands. For context, 1 talent could pay a skilled worker for 10 years. This was the accumulated wealth of 2 centuries of empire. The Battle of Gaugamela wasn't just a Macedonian victory. It was a demonstration of how tactical innovation and combined arms warfare could overcome massive numerical superiority. The Sarissa Phalanx had held the centre against overwhelming odds, creating the anvil on which Alexander's cavalry could hammer the Persians. But the story of the Sarissa Phalanx doesn't end with the defeat of Persia. Alexander spent the next 7 years campaigning across Central Asia and into India, pushing his army to the limits of the known world. The Phalanx went with him. In every major battle, whether against Scythian cavalry in Central Asia, mountain tribes in Afghanistan, or King Porus's war elephants in India, the Phalanx formed the backbone of Alexander's army. But Alexander gradually relied on it less. As he incorporated Asian troops and tactics into his army, the rigid Macedonian phalanx became less central to his strategy. The terrain of Central Asia and India didn't favour the phalanx's strengths. Mountain warfare, river crossings, elephant charges, these required flexibility the phalanx couldn't provide. By 326 BC, when Alexander faced King Porus at the Hydaspes River in India, the battle was won primarily by cavalry manoeuvres and light infantry. The phalanx was still there, still dangerous, but no longer the decisive weapon it had been. Alexander died in 323 BC in Babylon at age 32, possibly from typhoid fever, possibly from poisoning, possibly from alcoholism. The debate continues. What didn't continue was the unified empire. Within hours of his death, his generals began manoeuvring for power. The wars of the Diadochi, the Successor wars, would tear Alexander's empire apart for the next 40 years. But every successor state kept the Sarissa Phalanx. The Seleucid Empire in Syria and Mesopotamia, the Ptolemaic Kingdom in Egypt, Macedon under the Antigonids, all relied on pike-armed infantry as their core, military force. The phalanx became the standard heavy infantry throughout the Hellenistic world. The successors even tried to improve on Alexander's design, creating pikes up to 22 feet long. These proved unwieldy and were eventually abandoned in favour of the original 18-foot length Philip had designed. The phalanx dominated battlefields for another century and a half, remaining undefeated against any non-phalanx force. But eventually, it met an enemy whose tactical system could counter it: Rome. The Romans had developed the Manipular Legion, a flexible system of smaller infantry units that could adapt to terrain and changing battle conditions. Where the phalanx was rigid, requiring flat ground and tight formation, the legion could fight on hills, in forests, on broken ground. Most crucially, Roman legions could attack the phalanx's flanks and rear. At Cynocephali in 197 BC and Pydna in 168 BC, Roman legions defeated Macedonian phalanxes by outmanoeuvring them, finding gaps, attacking from the sides. Once the phalanx formation broke, the phalangites' long pikes became useless and they were slaughtered. The Romans' gladius, a short stabbing sword, was perfect for close-in fighting where the sarissa was too long to manoeuvre. The end of the phalanx came not because it was a bad tactical system, but because warfare had evolved. The Romans had created logistics, discipline, and tactical flexibility that matched what Philip had achieved, then exceeded it. But for 200 years, from Philip's reforms in 359 BC to the final defeat of the Antigonids in 168 BC, the Sarissa Phalanx was the premier heavy infantry system in the ancient world. Its impact on military history cannot be overstated. Philip and Alexander had proven that tactical innovation could overcome numerical superiority. They demonstrated that professional training and discipline beat part-time militia. They showed that combined arms, infantry and cavalry working in concert was superior to either arm fighting alone. The Sarissa Phalanx shattered the Persian Empire because it represented something new in warfare. Not just a longer spear, but an entire system of weapons, tactics, training, organisation and leadership integrated into a coherent whole. When Alexander crossed into Asia in 334 BC, he brought more than an army. He brought 2 decades of Philip's revolutionary thinking, embodied in 9,000 phalangites who moved as one, struck as one, and conquered the largest empire in the world. The mathematics of the Sarissa were simple. An 18-foot pike outreached a 7-foot spear. 5 layers of spear points beat 1. Disciplined formation beat individual prowess. But the psychology was more complex. Persian soldiers facing a Macedonian phalanx saw an advancing forest of iron, each point capable of killing, knowing they had to walk into that hedge of death and somehow survive long enough to strike back. Very few could. The battles of the Granicus, Issus and Gaugamela weren't foregone conclusions. Alexander nearly died multiple times. His army faced crisis points in every battle. The outcomes weren't predetermined by technological superiority. But when Macedonian discipline held, when the phalanx maintained its formation, when Alexander's tactical genius placed his forces at the right place at the right time, the Sarissa gave them the decisive edge. In the end, Alexander's conquest of Persia was made possible by his father's innovation. Philip II had looked at traditional Greek warfare and imagined something better. He took the best elements from Thebes, Athens, Thrace and Scythia, synthesized them, and created a weapon system that dominated its era. The Sarissa Phalanx was Philip's greatest achievement, refined and perfected by Alexander, wielded to conquer half the known world. When we remember Alexander the Great, we should also remember the weapon that made his victories possible. An 18-foot cornel woodpike, wielded by disciplined professional soldiers, arranged in formations their enemies couldn't match. The Sarissa Phalanx shattered the Persian Empire not through brutal force alone, but through the marriage of tactical innovation, rigorous training, brilliant leadership, and soldiers willing to die in formation rather than break. That was the true revolution Philip and Alexander brought to warfare, and its echoes resonate through military history to this day. The legacy of the Sarissa Phalanx extends far beyond the battlefield victories that destroyed Persia. To understand its true revolutionary nature, we need to examine the weapon itself in greater technical detail, the training required to master it, and the profound ways it changed not just military tactics, but the entire structure of Macedonian society. The construction of a sarissa was an engineering challenge that required sophisticated metallurgy and woodworking. Ancient sources, particularly Theophrastus in his botanical writings, tell us that cornel wood was preferred for its unique properties. This wood, from the cornus mast tree, combined flexibility with tremendous strength. A sarissa shaft needed to flex under stress without breaking, absorbing the shock of impact when the entire front rank struck simultaneously. Modern experimental archaeology has revealed just how precise this construction had to be. A team of researchers at the University of Thessaloniki recreated authentic sarissas using ancient techniques and discovered that the weight distribution was critical. The spearhead alone weighed between 1 and 2 pounds, typically forged from iron rather than bronze. Persian and earlier Greek spears often used bronze points, but iron held a sharper edge and could penetrate armour more effectively. The bronze butt spike, the saurata, weighed approximately the same as the spearhead, creating balance. Without this counterweight, the forward weight of 18 feet of wood and iron would make the weapon impossible to hold horizontally for more than a few seconds. Even with perfect balance, holding a sarissa in combat position required extraordinary strength and endurance. The two-piece design Philip implemented was genius. The joint mechanism used a bronze sleeve that fitted over both sections, secured by a pin or rivet. This meant that if the front section broke in combat, a common occurrence when pikes clashed, the warrior could remove the broken piece and continue fighting with a shorter but still functional weapon. Archaeological evidence from Vagina, the ancient Macedonian capital, has uncovered several of these bronze coupling sleeves, confirming ancient descriptions. But the weapon was only as effective as the man wielding it. The training regimen Philip instituted was unprecedented in the Greek world, and provides insight into how Macedonia transformed from a weak kingdom to a military superpower in less than 2 decades. New recruits underwent a probationary period lasting 6 months to a year. During this time, they learned basic drill movements without weapons. They practiced marching in step, a skill that seems simple but requires coordination when performed by thousands simultaneously. They learned to dress their lines, maintaining exact spacing between files. They practiced the various formations, from the open order used for marching with 6 feet between men, to the intermediate order for combat approach with 3 feet spacing, to the compressed synaspismos with barely 18 inches between warriors. Only after mastering these fundamentals were recruits issued their sarissas. The first exercises with the pike were individual. Each man had to learn the proper grip. The right hand held the sarissa approximately 4 feet from the butt spike, providing leverage and control. The left hand gripped roughly 2 feet ahead of the right, giving stability and allowing the warrior to thrust or adjust the angle. The physical conditioning was brutal. Phalangites had to develop muscles that didn't exist in normal human activity. The shoulders, forearms, and core muscles all had to work in concert to hold the pike horizontal while marching. Modern reenactors report that even fit individuals can barely hold an authentic sarissa in combat position for 5 minutes before their arms begin shaking uncontrollably. Philip's soldiers trained for hours daily, building the specific muscle memory and endurance needed. They practiced transitions from marching order to combat order, lowering their pikes from the vertical carrying position to horizontal in one smooth motion. This had to be synchronized across an entire battalion. If even a dozen men were out of sync, gaps would appear in the pike hedge. More complex were the maneuvers required in actual combat. The phalanx had to be able to wheel, turning 90 degrees while maintaining formation. This meant the inner flank had to nearly halt while the outer flank quick marched, all while keeping pikes levelled. One misstep and men would impale their own comrades. They practiced the doubling manoeuvre, where files closed up from 16 ranks deep to 8 ranks, each man stepping sideways into a gap. This widened the phalanx frontage, crucial when facing a wider enemy line. The reverse, condensing from 8 ranks back to 16, was equally important when needing to present a narrower but deeper formation against focused attack. The countermarch was perhaps the most complex drill. This allowed the front ranks, exhausted from combat, to rotate to the rear while fresh troops moved forward, all without breaking formation or lowering pikes. Each file would essentially reverse, with the rear rank becoming the front. This required the entire unit to stop, perform an about-face, then resume marching in the opposite direction while the former front ranks moved through the formation to the rear. These maneuvers weren't theoretical exercises. Ancient battle accounts describe Macedonian phalanxes performing them under fire. At the Battle of Issus, when the phalanx crossed the Pinarus River and the formation became disordered, the taxis had to reform while in contact with the enemy. At Gaugamela, units had to wheel and countermarch to face threats from multiple directions simultaneously. The psychological training was equally important. Philip understood that courage wasn't innate but could be cultivated through unit cohesion and conditioning. The regional recruiting system meant each taxis was composed of men from the same area who had known each other before military service. They trained together, marched together, fought together, and if necessary, died together. The penalty for breaking formation was death. Not just execution by military justice, though that was possible, but actual death in combat. A phalangite who ran exposed everyone around him. The files were so tightly packed that a gap immediately propagated, like removing a stone from an arch. Ancient accounts describe entire formations collapsing because a single file broke under pressure. This created intense peer pressure. No man wanted to be responsible for his neighbours' deaths. More positively, the shared hardship of training and campaigning created bonds that made men unwilling to abandon their companions. Modern military psychology recognises this principle. Soldiers don't fight for abstract causes, they fight for the men beside them. Philip reinforced this with a sophisticated system of rewards and honours. The foot companions weren't just a name. They received preferential treatment in land grants after campaigns. Their families were protected and provided for if they died in service. Successful officers could rise through the ranks regardless of birth, though nobles still dominated the highest positions. The really revolutionary aspect was how this military system transformed Macedonian society. Before Philip, Macedonia was a feudal kingdom where regional nobles commanded their own forces and frequently ignored or defied the king. Philip's professional army broke this pattern. The taxiers were royal troops, paid by the king, loyal to the king, led by officers the king appointed. This centralisation of military power allowed Philip to centralise political power. Nobles who refused to serve in the new army found themselves marginalised. Those who embraced the system and proved themselves competent were promoted and rewarded. Within a generation, the Macedonian nobility had transformed from semi-independent warlords to professional officers in a royal army. The economic implications were equally profound. A standing professional army required steady funding. Philip's capture of the Pangaean gold mines provided this, but it also required developing a sophisticated fiscal administration. Taxes had to be collected regularly. Pay had to be distributed on schedule. Equipment had to be manufactured and maintained. This necessitated growth in Macedonia's administrative capacity. Scribes, treasurers, quartermasters, all these positions had to be created and filled. Macedonia developed a bureaucracy to support its military machine. This administrative infrastructure would prove crucial when Alexander launched his Asian campaign, allowing him to govern and tax conquered territories efficiently. The logistics of maintaining his Sarissa armed phalanx on campaign were staggering. Each soldier needed his 18-foot pike, his helmet, his bronze or iron cuirass, his greaves, his small shield, his short sword as a backup weapon. The total weight of equipment exceeded 50 pounds. During forced marches, soldiers also carried personal supplies including food, water and bedding, adding another 30 pounds. Philip's forced marches, which sometimes covered 30 miles in a day through mountainous terrain, weren't just physical conditioning, they were logistical training. The army had to learn to move quickly without becoming strung out or leaving vulnerable gaps. Supply trains had to keep pace, scouts had to find water sources, foragers had to locate food. Alexander inherited this logistical system and expanded it dramatically. When he invaded Asia, his army included engineers, surveyors, secretaries, historians, scientists, and even a contingent of philosophers. This wasn't excess. It was recognizing that conquest required more than military victory. It required the ability to occupy, administer, and integrate conquered territories. The Sarissa Phalanx campaigns in Asia revealed both the weapon's strengths and its limitations. At the Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela, the phalanx fought on relatively open terrain where it could deploy effectively. But much of Alexander's campaigning was in mountains, forests, and broken country, where the long pikes were nearly useless. In Bactria and Sogdiana, modern Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, Alexander faced guerrilla warfare from mounted archers who refused pitched battle. The phalanx couldn't catch cavalry and was vulnerable to hit-and-run tactics. Alexander increasingly relied on more mobile forces, Macedonian cavalry, hypaspists who could fight as either heavy or light infantry, and mercenary troops. The siege warfare that characterized much of the Asian campaign also negated the phalanx's advantages. At Tyre, Alexander built a causeway to reach the island city, a massive engineering project where infantry fought as labourers and assault troops rather than in formation. At the Sogdian Rock, Macedonians scaled vertical cliffs to attack a supposedly impregnable fortress. The Sarissa stayed in camp during these operations. The climactic battle at the Hydaspes River against King Porus demonstrated how Alexander had evolved beyond relying solely on the phalanx. Porus fielded 200 war elephants, animals the Macedonians had never faced in significant numbers. Elephants were specifically effective against dense infantry formations. They couldn't be stopped by pikes, and horses were terrified of them, limiting cavalry effectiveness. Alexander's solution was tactical flexibility. He crossed the Hydaspes during a storm using weather and terrain to mask his movements. When he encountered Porus's army, Alexander used his cavalry and light infantry to isolate and destroy the Indian cavalry and chariots first. The elephants were targeted by javelin men and archers who wounded them until the maddened animals turned and stampeded through their own lines. Only after the elephants were neutralized did the phalanx advance to engage Porus's infantry. Even then, the phalanx's role was secondary to cavalry maneuvers. Alexander had learned that the Sarissa Phalanx was a tool, tremendously effective in the right circumstances but not a universal solution. The mutiny at the Hephaestus River in 326 BC, when the army refused to march further east into India, marked the end of Alexander's conquests. The men were exhausted, thousands of miles from home, having campaigned for 8 years through deserts, mountains and jungles, They had faced every imaginable enemy from Greek hoplites to Scythian cavalry to Indian war elephants. They wanted to go home. Alexander turned west, but the return journey was nearly as arduous as the conquest. The march through the Gedrosian desert killed thousands. The fleet under Narses faced storms and hostile coastlines. By the time the army reached Babylon in 323 BC, it had been reduced by disease, combat, and desertion to a fraction of its original strength. When Alexander died without a clear heir, his generals immediately began positioning themselves for power. Perdiccas, the senior cavalry commander, tried to hold the empire together as regent. Ptolemy seized Egypt, Seleucus took Babylon and the eastern satrapies, Antigonus claimed Asia Minor, Lysimachus held Thrace. Cassander controlled Macedonia itself. The wars of the Diadochi were fought with the military system Philip and Alexander had created. Every successor state maintained Sarissa armed phalanxes as their core heavy infantry. The battles between successor kingdoms were clashes between pike formations, tests of discipline and endurance, where marginal advantages in training or morale determined victory. The Battle of Ipsus in 301 BC was the largest engagement of the Successor Wars. Antigonus and his son Demetrius commanded 70,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry, including thousands of phalangites. They faced a coalition of Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Cassander, with even greater numbers, plus Seleucus's war elephants from India. The battle was decided not by the phalanxes but by cavalry and elephants. Demetrius's cavalry charge succeeded initially, but he pursued too far and couldn't return in time. Seleucus's elephants blocked his route back to the battlefield. Antigonus's phalanx, surrounded and cut off from support, held formation and fought until Antigonus himself was killed. The phalangites then surrendered en masse, transferring their loyalty to the victorious coalition. This pattern repeated throughout the Hellenistic period. Phalanxes rarely broke in combat against other phalanxes. Battles were decided by cavalry maneuvers, elephants, or light infantry exploiting terrain advantages. The pike formations had become so effective that they cancelled each other out, creating stalemate in the centre, while mobile forces determined outcomes on the flanks. The successor kingdoms also competed in phalanx development, leading to some questionable innovations. The Seleucid army under Antiochus III experimented with sarissas up to 22 feet long. In theory, this gave even greater reach advantage. In practice, the weapons were too heavy and unwieldy. Soldiers couldn't maintain them in combat position, and the formation lost mobility. Ptolemaic Egypt developed a variation using native Egyptian soldiers alongside Macedonian phalangites. The Egyptians were equipped as traditional pikemen, but never achieved the discipline and training of the Macedonian corps. At the Battle of Raphia in 217 BC, the Egyptian phalanx performed adequately, but clearly inferior to Seleucid Macedonians. The Macedonian kingdom under the Antigonid dynasty maintained the purest version of Philip's original system. They had the advantage of recruiting from the same population that had produced Alexander's veterans. Macedonian phalangites remained the gold standard for pike infantry throughout the Hellenistic period. But the kingdoms faced a strategic problem. The Sarissa Phalanx was expensive to maintain. Professional soldiers required regular pay, training took time, equipment was costly. The successor kingdoms were wealthy by ancient standards, but they couldn't match the resources of the original Persian Empire Alexander had conquered. More critically, the manpower pool was limited. Macedonians and Greeks were minorities in their own kingdoms, ruling over much larger populations of Asians and Egyptians. The phalanx depended on soldiers with the cultural background and training to function in such rigid formations. Native troops could be trained in pike tactics, but they rarely achieved the same effectiveness. This created a death spiral. As casualties mounted in the constant wars between successor kingdoms, replacing experienced phalangites became harder. Training time shortened by necessity. Quality declined. The phalanx remained formidable against non-pike armies, but lost the overwhelming superiority it had enjoyed under Philip and Alexander. Meanwhile, Rome was developing a different military system. The Roman legion of the Middle Republic was organized around maniples, small units of 120 men that could operate independently or in coordination. 3 lines of maniples created depth, with veteran troops in the rear ready to reinforce or replace the forward lines. The legion's flexibility came from its looser formation and shorter weapons. Roman legionaries carried two pila, heavy javelins thrown at close range to disrupt enemy formations. For close combat, they used the gladius, a short, stabbing sword ideal for fighting in tight quarters. Their shields, the scutum, were large and rectangular, offering more protection than the phalangite's small pelter. Most importantly, Roman tactical doctrine emphasized adapting to terrain and circumstances. Maniples could fight on hills, in forests, or on broken ground where phalanxes struggled. They could open gaps to let chariots or elephants through, then close and destroy them. They could refuse one flank while advancing the other. The clash between phalanx and legion was inevitable. As Rome expanded into the Greek world in the early 2nd century BC, conflict with the Hellenistic kingdoms became unavoidable. The question was whether Philip's revolutionary system could defeat Rome's evolved legion tactics. The first major test came at Cynoscephaly in 197 BC. Philip V of Macedon, descendant of Alexander's general Cassander, faced the Roman consul Titus Quinctius Flamininus. Philip commanded 26,000 men, including 16,000 phalangites. Flamininus led about the same number, primarily Roman legionaries and Italian allies. The battle began on rough hilly terrain, exactly the worst ground for a phalanx. Philip should have refused battle, but Roman forces were ravaging his territory and he needed a decisive victory. The phalanx advanced uphill against the Roman right wing and actually succeeded, driving the legionaries back through sheer mass and the reach advantage of the Sarissa. But on the Macedonian left, the legion exploited the broken ground. Roman maniples flowed around obstacles, maintaining formation where the phalanx struggled. As gaps appeared in the Macedonian left, Roman troops infiltrated through them. A Roman tribune, unnamed in the sources, took 20 maniples and attacked the rear of the Macedonian right wing that was still pushing forward against the Roman right. Attacked from behind, the phalanx collapsed. Once the tight formation broke, the long sarissas became liabilities. Phalangites couldn't turn quickly to face the new threat. Their pikes were too long for close-quarters fighting. Roman legionaries with short swords and maneuverable shields butchered them. 8,000 Macedonians died. 5,000 were captured. Roman losses were perhaps 700. Philip V survived but lost Greece. Macedonia became a Roman client state. The defeat wasn't conclusive proof of the legion's superiority. The terrain had been unfavourable, and the Macedonians had made tactical errors. But it suggested that the phalanx's invincibility was ending. The final test came at Pydna in 168 BC. Philip's son Perseus commanded 43,000 men, including 20,000 phalangites, the best trained and equipped Macedonian army in generations. The Roman consul, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, led 33,000 mostly seasoned legionaries. Paulus chose his ground carefully, flat terrain that favoured the phalanx, because he understood that defeating the phalanx on ideal ground would demonstrate definitive superiority. The battle opened with the Macedonian phalanx advancing in perfect formation, an unbroken wall of pike points. Roman accounts describe the terror of facing the advancing sarissas. Plutarch records Paulus saying he had never seen anything more frightening than the Macedonian phalanx in full advance. The front ranks of Roman legionaries broke and retreated before the pike hedge, unable to close. But as the phalanx advanced, crossing rough ground and pursuing the retreating Romans, gaps began appearing in the formation. Small at first, just a few feet between taxis, but Roman centurions spotted them immediately. Maniples were ordered into the gaps, attacking the phalanx from the sides where the long pikes couldn't be brought to bear. What followed was slaughter. Phalangites in the interior ranks couldn't even see what was happening. They maintained formation, pikes levelled, while Romans attacked their flanks and rear. The sarissa was useless in close quarters. Some Macedonians tried to use their short swords, but they were outmatched by Roman training in close combat. 20,000 Macedonians died at Pydna. Perseus fled and was captured. Macedonia was dissolved as a kingdom, divided into 4 client republics. The last heir of Alexander's empire was gone, and with it the military system Philip had created. The phalanx's defeat wasn't due to inferior weapons or cowardice. The system that had dominated for 2 centuries had been countered by an enemy that emphasized flexibility over rigidity, small unit tactics over mass formation, and adaptability over adherence to doctrine. Rome had learned from the phalanx's strengths and developed a system to exploit its inherent weaknesses. Yet the legacy of the Sarissa Phalanx extends beyond its battlefield record. Philip and Alexander had proven that professional training and discipline could create military superiority. They demonstrated that combined arms tactics, infantry and cavalry working together, were essential for decisive victory. They showed that logistics, administration, and long-term planning were as important as tactical skill. These lessons influenced military thought for millennia. The Roman legion that defeated the Phalanx incorporated many of its principles, including professional training, regular pay, standardized equipment, and systematic drill. Medieval Swiss pike formations were conscious attempts to recreate phalanx tactics. Early modern pike and shot tactics combined elements of both phalanx and legion. The Sarissa itself appeared in various forms throughout history. Renaissance Swiss and German Landsknecht pikemen used weapons 15 to 18 feet long, remarkably similar to Philip's original design. These formations dominated European battlefields for 2 centuries until firearms made pike formations obsolete. In the end, the Sarissa Phalanx shattered the Persian Empire because it represented a quantum leap in military effectiveness. For the first time, infantry armed with pikes and trained to fight in rigid formation could dominate cavalry and defeat numerically superior forces. The weapon system gave Alexander the tool he needed to conquer half the known world. But it was never just about the weapon. The Sarissa succeeded because of the training that made it effective, the discipline that kept formations intact under stress, the leadership that deployed it wisely, and the soldiers who wielded it with skill and courage. Philip created the system. Alexander perfected and deployed it. Thousands of Macedonian phalangites made it work through their sweat, blood, and sacrifice. Together they changed the course of history, and their influence echoes through military doctrine to this day.